Testing. Hello everybody, and welcome to ToyCon. Who's enjoying themselves today? Yeah, Santa Rosa is the place, I'm telling you. Everyone I talk to is having a fantastic, wonderful time, and that's exactly what is needed on this extremely hot day. Who's sweating out there? Because I'll tell you what, I'm dying. You know, I wasn't expecting it to be so hot up here. Coming from San Jose, California, we're kind of, you know, used to all the heat. But I'm telling you, it's really hot. So anyways, let me introduce myself first. My name is Davidson L. Haworth. I'm a fantasy author. I've been writing for many, many years. I've written for television. I've written for motion pictures. I've done many things in regards to writing, but my true love is fantasy writing. And today, basically, the subject that I'll be talking about is writing vampires in the 21st century. And the reason why ToyCon wanted to bring up this subject matter is basically in the recent maybe 5 or 6 years, vampires have been revamped, no pun intended, that they've changed from Max Schreck, if you remember him from the movie Nosferatu. Has anyone ever seen that? That's one of the greatest vampire movies of all time. You know, and if you're a horror buff, sometimes those silent movies are scarier than the movies you see today in theaters. And the reason why that is because the way they shot the film, you know, camera angles, use shadows, the whole imagery. Universal Studios perfected those images, specifically in Bela Lugosi in Dracula. If you go back and you just watch those movies, and you watch the original Dracula compared to a horror movie today, the Dracula movie from 1930 is going to scare me. It scares me much more than these blood and gore movies. Freddy Krueger. Those are, to me, they're almost like popcorn films. And basically, the reason why ToyCon wanted me to come up and speak about vampires is I have a fantasy trilogy. The last book was released this year. The first book was titled The Dragon of Prowley. The second book, The Wizard of Prowley. And the last book, The Vampires of Prowley. And it all takes place in an actual, real existing town in Italy, near the French border up in the Appalachian Mountains. And the two characters, at the end of this trilogy, they fight the vampire empire and save the world from destruction, basically. If you're interested in my books, I'm just right over behind here, not too far. And I should be back by 3 after I'm done talking here. A little bit about myself as well. I like to do a lot of conventions. I did WonderCon. I'm going to be doing Comic-Con coming out next month. I just did a European tour, you know, through Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And in that part of the world, they're extremely interested in vampires, specifically because the original vampire originated from Hungary, Transylvania, right? But what we find in the early days of vampires, Bela Lugosi, for example, and my favorite actor to play Dracula, Christopher Lee. He is the Hammer films, and exactly like I mentioned before, the way they're shot, you know, and filmed, it's incredible, and nothing can compare to Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. Peter Cushing is a complete legend. I mean, to me, he walks on water. And if you've never seen any of the Hammer films or Peter Cushing, definitely go to Netflix, check one out. You'll just enjoy it. And you know, nowadays, considering today's standards, they're pretty decent for kids. I think now Hammer films will be basically rated PG or PG-13, where, you know, back in the day, you know, they were more of a rated R. But Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee and, you know, Max Schreck, when they were playing vampires, basically, the original vampires, they're walking dead. They live on human blood most of the time. But they'll take blood any way they can get it, right? And now we find ourselves in the 21st century, and we have a little bit of a dilemma. Vampires today seem to be written for 11 to 15-year-old teenage girls, you know? I'll say this, vampires don't go to high school. Vampires don't date the prom queen. Vampires don't rip off their shirt and the sun is glistening off their body. I mean, that is not a vampire. And I think we all know what we're talking about. I don't have to mention the movies or the books. Yeah, I'm sure they're great entertainment for some people, but you know what? Those are not vampires. You know, and people come up to me, oh, did you see, you know, this film, are you like Team Edward or any of this kind of rubbish? And I say, you know what? Pick up a Hammer film. Pick up Christopher Lee. That's a real vampire. So what I tell people in the 21st century, these movies that make vampires look like, you know, they're, you know, going to high school, these are not real vampires. They are familiar. So basically, Twilight series and Twilight books, if you're looking at vampires in a traditional sense, they are books and movies about familiar. And familiar, what those are is they're human beings who are servants to true vampires. How many people have seen the movie, the Blade series? Or who reads Blade, right? Now, Blade has it spot on, okay? Now, you have two types. You have the real vampires, then you have the familiar, the people who can walk around during the day, the humans, and they serve, or they're slaves to vampires. Well, Twilight, if you look at it that way, of the traditional vampire, they're not vampires at all. They're just glorified familiar who serve vampires. So, in my latest book that came out in January, The Vampires of Prowley, I bring back the original vampires, real bloodsuckers, okay? And, you know, I use familiars as the way they should be used. For example, in my book, there is this one familiar who sneaks into the bedrooms of children and kidnaps children and bring the infants to the vampires, so the vampires, when they wake up in the evening, can feed during the night. Those are real vampires, and those are real familiars. And when you think about that, people creeping into the bedrooms of children and snatching them to feed them to vampires, if you think about that's horrifying to think about. Okay, but that's what we're talking about, horror. That's why they call it horror films or horror stories. Okay, horror movies, the vampire is not going to high school and, you know, and this and this. And this is what I tend to bring to the 21st century of vampire writing, because today, I think, in regards to vampires, people have lost their way in regards to it. You know, I'm sure it's fine and dandy, you know, the Twilight series, but you're not reading about vampires. Those are not vampires. Who's seen a good Christopher Lee movie or Bela Lugosi? I mean, I think a lot of us have. And Bela Lugosi, he was Hungarian. And
don't forget to go to the Toy Con round.
A lot of people,
there are prizes that retail up to $1,000 each.
They got two things going on at the same time. A lot of people don't realize he was Hungarian, but he was so involved in his role that it was difficult for him to get out of it. And he enjoyed the Dracula character. And in fact, when he died, he was actually buried in his original Dracula costume from the Universal movies. And like Max Schreck, in Nosferatu, people were beginning to believe that maybe he was a real vampire, and that's how convincing he is, and that's how amazing of an actor he is. Well, we know Christopher Lee didn't take it to that point, Christopher Lee is a very versatile actor. I mean, he's still acting today, Lord of the Rings, Count Dooku, and, the new cycle, the new Star Wars. I'm more of a fan of the Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher stuff. And not to get sidetracked a little bit, but in regards to Star Wars, when the new films came out, I was like stoked about it. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And actually I saw episode 1 like 8 times in the theater. But the reason why I did that, I was so hungry for Star Wars. But now as time goes by, you realize nothing compares to 4, 5, and 6 of those episodes. I mean, 1, 2, and 3 it's not even the same universe. So somewhere down the line, I think George Lucas kind of lost his mind. He went to a different direction when he started fixing up all these films and trying to perfect them, but he never realized that what he released the first time was pure perfection. And that's, and sometimes that happens to people. They want to make everything perfect. Like Leo Tolstoy, when he wrote War and Peace, once it was released, he kept rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, trying to perfect it. And sometimes there are works that, they're perfect the first time. You don't need to change anything. And this is kind of like with vampires. The original vampires, they were perfect from the beginning. You don't have to change them, okay? And even in the 70s with the Hammer films, I don't know if you're familiar with the black exploitation films, but a very popular Dracula movie was Blackula from the 70s. And, now we look at it as it's comedic, But in the 70s, yeah, it was kind of a sense of a B movie, but we enjoyed the horror of it. And it also gave us a new look at vampires, a vampire in another culture, basically. And, but they didn't change the premise. He was still a walking dead, a vampire's walking dead, who predominantly focus on the females, because he could allure them, you see. And, before Blackula, if you watch a lot of the Hammer films, you have two different cultures between the Hammer films and the Blackula Dracula films. Very similar. The characters are exactly similar, but they're in two different cultures. And in the Hammer films, you pretty much have, how do I call it? Kind of like a white bread society, But in Blackula, you have like, he's dealing with the pimps and the hustlers and the prostitutes, and you're like Dracula in a whole different way of looking at him, in a whole different realm. And that is what fascinates people who love, the vampire genre, specifically, in the 70s, when vampires, I believe, were at their height. Another where I feel that vampires have kind of gone astray was, in the 80s and 90s. You had like Dracula 2000 and all of these types of movies. The Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was very good with Winona Ryder. But it still kept to that premise. Okay, all of a sudden, in the last 5 years, one person gets the idea of having vampires date girls, going to high school, driving past cars, ripping off their t-shirt, and, getting a fan club going. That destroys the whole fabric of the vampire. And like I said, now vampires are they're familiars. Now, Anne Rice How many people have read Interview with a Vampire? Yeah? See, she had also the right idea. You know, she didn't change the vampire. You don't have to reinvent the vampire. You don't. A vampire is a character, a being that is eternal, exactly like the character was created. Vampires are eternal and don't need to be changed because it is society that changes, but the vampire always stays the same, right? And that's what makes him scary. It's like everything around him is changing, except for him. And he's always the dominating one. No matter how much society changes, he is still always the dominant one, you know? So now we come to today, and we're coming to a point where people are starting to think, you know, we have these Twilight films, and now we know they're not true vampires. But now we're beyond that now. It's over with. You know, the series is over, the books are pretty much over. You know, and now we're getting books, for example, my book, that are bringing back the traditional vampires. And why are we bringing back the traditional vampires? Is because we looked back on those original films that I just previously mentioned, and we rewatched them, and we realized, no, these are scary films. These scare us. These are the films that give us nightmares, not the latter. So we find that now people are writing original vampires. Who watches Vampire Diaries? Does anyone watch Vampire Diaries at all? Yeah, a little bit. But at least their vampires don't go to high school. You see, I mean, and this is the thing. So we see these shows, and they're going strictly back to the traditional way of writing vampires. Let me ask you a question. What do you find intriguing about vampires? Yeah, and to repeat the question, if you couldn't hear, is what makes, you know, for this gentleman, a vampire compelling is they're so dominant, you know. They're so much in control, you know. I mean, how many people here in their lives would like to have the kind of control a vampire has? You know what I mean? I mean, Winona Ryder looks into the eyes, of Dracula, and boom, automatically, you know, she's in his arms. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm sure majority of men would kind of like that power against Winona Ryder for sure. So now we find ourselves coming, to a point where it's a battle between the wannabe vampires and the traditional. But I see that we're going back to the traditional, and the reason why is everything repeats itself. In film, in trends, even history, we say, repeats itself. And even in fads and fashion, like, for example, whoever thought video games and the way people dressed in the 80s would be coming back? You know what I mean? If you lived in the 80s, you never thought, oh, this stuff's not going to come back. But it does, and everything recycles itself. So now we're seeing vampires coming back to its true form. So I'm happy to say. So anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say about writing vampires in the 21st century. But it's just that today it's just much more difficult because you have a generation who thinks of vampires in a completely different way, in the non-traditional way. And when I'm selling my book, for example, today here at ToyCon, you know, I have people coming up to me, are these like traditional vampires? Do they come out at night and suck the blood out of people and do kidnappings? I said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And people ask me that all the time because people want the traditional vampires to come back. You know, they want to read something and be afraid. And that's why people gravitate to horror films. You know, we want to go to a movie and, you know, we want to feel that fear, but at the same time know we're safe. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a roller coaster. Many of us is not going to jump off a cliff or, you know, with a parachute or make a rock climbing, but we'll go on a roller coaster because we know it's dangerous, but also at the same time safe. And this is what vampires bring to us, is in film and in books. In writing vampires, you know, you have to go back when you're writing it to remember all those old traditional ways, the garlic, wearing the garlic, and the crucifixes, and all of these different types of elements that Van Helsing used against Dracula and other vampires. Another movie I thought was great, which I'm surprised it didn't have a sequel, was Van Helsing with not Hugh Jackman. Am I right? Hugh Jackman. And you know what? I thought that was a great film. You know, I mean, I don't want to say it's like great, like Universal, you know, Bela Lugosi's over Amazon. I mean, for what it was great. It was good. And I think that was one of the last movies besides the Blade series that actually gave us traditional vampires. And then after that, people kind of forgot, except for those who remember the older films. And I was disappointed that they didn't make another Van Helsing film. You know, I was really hoping that they would. You know, you know, for me, I just think they should have kept with the vampires. I didn't quite understand the whole Frankenstein, Wolfman stuff, and I know that they wanted to add those in and, you know, kind of hark back to those older Universal films. But I think it would have been good just as a standalone with Dracula and, you know, his followers. So what I would have done was I would have made Van Helsing versus Dracula, and then I would have made a second movie where he fights the Wolfman. You know, I'd probably made a trilogy out of it. But for some reason they didn't make it. And Hugh Jackman, well, let's face it. I mean, when we think of Hugh Jackman, what do we think? We think Wolverine. We don't think Van Helsing. And in regards to Wolverine and Hugh Jackman, he's kind of like Harrison Ford with Indiana Jones. And that's kind of a problem in a sense, or he's like Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man. I mean, if they were to tell you in the media that they're going to have a new Indiana Jones movie, but it's going to be Brad Pitt instead of Harrison Ford, would you go see it? Well, no, because Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones. You know, Hugh Jackman is Wolverine. Can you see someone else playing Wolverine but Hugh Jackman? You know, I don't think so. What about Robert Downey Jr. playing Iron Man? Can you see someone else playing Iron Man? Well, no, that's the thing, that they've conquered that. So now that's how we see them. In fact, Robert Downey Jr. asked for $100 million to do Iron Man 4. $100 million. Why? Because he knows that the fans see him only as Iron Man. So, you know, and I think we need to get to vampires in that way too. We only need to see vampires in that traditional sense. So in the future, I predict that now it's zombies. Now everyone's fascinated with zombies. Before that it was vampires. Then it's something else. So it goes in these stages. But I will predict when it's time for the vampires to come back around and they start becoming famous again, you know, in the popular culture, you're going to find that they're going to be more traditional and emulating Christopher Lee's Dracula. Absolutely. I don't know about you, but if I had to pick between Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, Christopher Lee was the best. I mean, when his eyes light up, you know, you were like, whoa, you were taken back by it. You know, you were just as mesmerized watching it on film as the characters were in the film. And that's what made him so great. So anyway, That's where I see it going. So, without any delay, does anyone have any questions for me in regards to writing or vampires or anything in the fantasy genre at all? Yes.
What are your thoughts on the vampire?
What are your thoughts on the Vampires of 30 Days of Night series?
You know, I think it's you know, it's well done. It's you know, it's a good series. You know, it harkens back to a lot of the originalities. You know, it brings back vampires to, in a sense, where they need to be. I think it's much better for